Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Balkan Devlan. I'm a senior fellow here at Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and welcome to our webinar today, Who You're Gonna Call, Why There's Something Strange in International Institutions. And we would like to welcome all our audience, for those who also get the reference to either the original movies or the new reboot, hoping to bridge the generational gap there. Today we'll talk about how we can reform the international institutions, who can do what, and under what circumstances do we need to think about building new institutions to protect our interests, defend our security, and promote our values. The COVID-19 crisis laid bare the inadequacies of the international institutional structure that has been under stress in the past few years, both by subversion attempts by our adversaries and authoritarian regimes in the international system, as well as rising populist and right-wing populism and across the Western world. So today we'd like to talk about how and why those institutions are being undermined, and what can be done to reform those institutions or build new ones to defend our values and interests. And as the saying goes, who are you going to call? Well, we called on three excellent experts today to talk about what should be done, both Canada and Europe and our allies across the globe. What should we be doing with regards to international institutions? Today with us, we have Dr. Cory Shake, who is the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at American Enterprise Institute. She is the author of Safe Passage, The Transition from British to American Hegemony, and a contributing writer at The Atlantic, War on the Rocks, and Bloomberg, and a well-known expert on transatlantic relations more broadly. We also have Dr. Olaf Wienzek, the director of the Multilateral Dialogue at Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's Geneva office. His office closely follows the work of the various Geneva-based multilateral organizations, and he is regularly requested as an expert on developments in Geneva by the media. Previously, he worked as an EU expert for Konrad Adenauer's Brussels and Berlin offices. And last but not least, we have MLI's own Dr. Charles Burton, a senior fellow here at the Institute in the Center for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad, as well as a non-resident senior fellow for the European Values Center for Security Policy. Dr. Burton is specialized in comparative politics, government and politics of China, Canada-China relations, and human rights. And he worked at the Canadian Foreign Ministry for a number of years, including being a consular at the Canadian Embassy to China in early 1990s and as well as late 90s. He was previously also worked at the Communications Security Establishment of the Canadian Department of National Defense. He is also one of the leading experts on China in Canada today. So without further ado, what I would like to do is to turn the floor to our panelists. Each panelist will talk about 7 or 8 minutes, making their initial statements. Then we will switch to a Q&A format. So please keep those questions coming through the YouTube, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. With that, I'd like to turn to Olaf first to have his opening statement and provide us with a view from Geneva. Olaf, over to you.
Thanks a lot, and very honored to be invited to speak in this kind of framework. Thanks a lot again for the invitation. Now, speaking from a Geneva perspective, multilateral organizations have been in a difficult state already before COVID-19. I mean, multilateral organizations or multilateralism has never been easy. The current situation is not catastrophic, but it's certainly not a very bright one if one thinks about the WTO, about the UN Human Rights Council, about the funding problems many of these organizations have, and about the relevance problems some of these organizations have. Some Geneva-based organizations are even here sometimes referred to as glorified think tanks. I would say this is kind of an exaggeration, but still it paints a picture. Now, the COVID-19 crisis has highlighted two somewhat paradoxical trends. I mean, on the one hand, it has shown that, well, it has shown basically the limitations of several of these multilateral bodies. On the other hand, the crisis has also underlined the enormous potential importance. I mean, with all the deficits of the WHO, I think it is relatively fair to say that without it, the situation would have been worse. If you want, I can elaborate later in the discussion, but it would have been worse. And that goes also for other organizations, be it humanitarian ones, be it also the WTO. At the same time, we see that the limited mandate of many of these organizations encourage them actually not to annoy bigger member states, which is, in my opinion, for example, why the WHO Director General has been so overly enthusiastic sometimes about certain steps China has taken in managing the crisis, and which, of course, seen from the outside, may seem sometimes a bit too enthusiastic or at least doubtful. It also demonstrates, the crisis also demonstrates that you don't need a destruction of these organizations, but you need a reform. What we also see, and what we also have been seeing these past years, and this is not a new development, is that multilateralism is not politically neutral. Everyone talks about multilateralism, but China or Russia may understand something quite different than we do when we talk about multilateralism. For us, it is closely linked to certain values, to certain norms. Why? For others, it's just a mere mechanism of cooperation. And China has been particularly assertive to fill the vacuum the West has left in some of these organizations. And it engages very heavily in some organizations, not in all of the Geneva-based organizations, but in some, particularly on those which are dealing with standard setting in economic or digital matters. And on the other hand, in those organizations, such as the UN Human Rights Council, where it hopes to water down or change the global understanding of certain norms, and norms which are so far coined rather by Western understanding. I can also develop with examples later on if needed. China is also trying to acquire reputation and credibility on the global scene by engaging in these organizations. I mean, in the context of COVID, we see this also. We saw this also at the World Health Assembly, when Xi Jinping tried to portray China as a global benefactor, promising to treat a vaccine as a global good. And this impression was, of course, even more powerful as the US president was not speaking at the World Health Assembly. So, of course, it gave a bigger floor for China. What we also see is that thus the West is sometimes punching below its weight in some of these international organizations, meaning taking too much time coordinating positions or not even managing to have a joint position, and struggling sometimes to fill the void the US has left these past years in some of these organizations. We have seen from the European side that there has been a stronger assertiveness to become a bigger actor in the area of global health. But I would say that still the other countries from the global West have not managed yet to fill the gap which the US has left in some, not in all, but in some of these organizations. Now, what to do very briefly? First, close the leadership gap of the West, both financially and politically, which means also that you must take multilateral organizations seriously. You can rant about their limitations, about their faults, but just because one retreats from them does not mean that the rest of the world will take these organizations less seriously. They will still be considered, even if when the US left, or at least threatened to leave some of these organizations, by a very large majority of other member states, they're still considered as the relevant fora. taking seriously these organizations means also engage on personnel policy. And we had one good example recently about the World Intellectual Property Organization, but we had also a couple of bad examples. Now, also something, and I think this is a very important point because it's often underestimated. It's difficult to be everywhere at once in these organizations. There is such a multitude from them, and some seem at the first glance very technical. But technical standards do matter. And we see it, for example, in the International Telecommunication Union, that China is basically flooding these organizations with proposals and with personnel and with expertise, where even the EU has sometimes real problems to catch up on all this. And this is something where it's very important also, where we don't have the manpower or, let's say, the expertise to divide and conquer in a certain way, meaning to divide tasks among countries, among different groups of member states. But of course, for this, you need a lot of trust. Then also trying to take the US on board wherever possible, especially now also with the new administration. It's absolutely crucial. Second issue, build alliances beyond the converted. I mean, we sometimes underestimate how small the core of the global West actually is in mere numbers in these organizations, particularly in those where you have a one country, one vote principle. Therefore, it is very crucial to build alliances among the global West beyond this kind of, let's say, this kind of core very quickly, meaning with countries, like-minded countries from Latin America, but also Africa and Southeast Asia, for example. Also calling out alternative multilateralism, pushing harder against, let's say, temptations from autocratic countries or let's say the attempts from autocratic countries to undermine our definitions of certain values, meaning overall also a tough love approach towards multilateral organization, meaning supporting them, but in a coordinated fashion, pushing for reform. That's absolutely crucial. For example, and this is my last point, on the WHO, you have a reform proposal from France and Germany, which I think is a very good one. From the US, from Korea, it gains much more traction, much more force if you can combine these reform processes into one more forceful one and not have all these separate initiatives. There is no silver bullet, but I think these small steps could help to improve the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olaf. This is great with the grand view and in a very actionable proposal suggestions. I think is very valuable while going forward, but also for the webinar as well when we get to the questions and answers, because it also opens up a lot of domain to discuss. So thank you very much for that. Now I'd like to turn to Corey to get your opening statements, and also if you can sort of squeeze in, given what we learned about the incoming Biden administration about yesterday with the Tony Blinken as the Secretary of State and what that could mean. Over to you, Corey.
So I want to start by complaining about Olaf, because he did such a great job outlining both the issues and the potential solutions that he left very little interesting or useful to say by the rest of us. So I want to start by demarching somebody else on the panel, because that was just fantastic.
I'd like to join you in the demarche.
Excellent. So next time Olaf gets to go last so that the rest of us can have something useful to say. I think he's exactly right, both about the diagnosis and about the prescription. There are two major dangers to multilateralism and international institutions right now, and they are China and the United States. And China, frankly, has a better strategy than the Trump administration has had, because China's strategy is to infiltrate, control standard setting and the behavior of international organizations by participating actively and by leading them. Whereas the Trump administration has simply opted out and left the playing field to illiberal forces, whether that is in the UN Human Rights Council, or whether it's in actually having nothing constructive to bring to NATO. right? The United States is typically the driver of institutional ambition for the multilateral organizations we're a part of. And it's very hard, as Olaf said, for middle powers to bring the momentum that the United States stomping in with an assertive agenda about what it wants other allies to do for us can help. I was reading recently President Eisenhower's speeches to the UN General Assembly, and it made me so homesick for a United States that understood that international organizations are actually amplifiers of the international order that the United States and its allies created out of the ashes of World War II. So I'm pleased to say that I think the new administration, President Biden's administration, really does have, it is a return to the creative multilateralism that the United States has mostly practiced in the last 70 years. And Tony Blinken, for those of you who don't know him, is a real force for good. The contrast between Secretary Pompeo aggressively going to the West Bank and being utterly deaf to the legitimate concerns of Palestinians, and Tony Blinken, when he was Deputy Secretary of State, recording with a Muppet a public service announcement about how to make refugees feel comfortable when they come to the United States. I think those two snapshots are the precursor. And I believe America's allies will heave a huge sigh of relief, even as they are rightly to always be worried about the way the American political system is tied so tightly to public attitudes, and the parties actually have very little control, which means that any idiot can get elected in the United States, and very often does. So there will be concern about whether the Trump administration was an anomaly. But I actually think that people, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, possibly Michelle Flournoy or Jay Johnson as Secretary of Defense, those will be reassuring choices. And they will be choices that portend a return to not just multilateralism, but to banding together of free societies to use the tools of free societies to combat the rise of authoritarian challengers, right? Why did we miss the chance when the Chinese head of Interpol disappeared into Chinese custody? That was an opportunity for those of us in the West to talk about the importance of transparency and the rule of law. And we missed that opportunity in large part because of missing American leadership. And I think the new administration won't miss those kinds of opportunities. We'll understand that we have to have competitive strategies that force the Chinese government into accountability and other unrepresentative governments into accountability. And let me just close with my favorite example of it. It's an example about climate change, where China is now the world's largest polluter. So all of us who care about climate need to find a way to bring the government of China constructively into the conversation. And the best move so far in doing that was the Republican governor of Utah, who the Obama administration made ambassador to Beijing. And what John Huntsman and his team did was put an air quality meter on the roof of the American embassy and then tweeted out the air quality index in Beijing. And that simple act, which cost me as a taxpayer only a couple of $100, forced the Chinese government into accountability with its own public, because the values that we in the West hold dear are universal: parents want clean air for their children, including Chinese parents. And that's how we in the West can band together and bring everyone else up to the standard of accountability and performance that we hold our own governments to. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Corey, for this optimistic take that the United States will be back as it was for most of the post-Cold War era. So hopefully you are right in that. And I think there's a lot to touch upon. Both you and Olaf mentioned with regards to how the democracies could and should band together and remember what multilateralism means to us. Something different than just for engagement for engagement's sake or cooperation for cooperation's sake. So that's a very important point that I would like to come back later on in the Q&A. But let me turn to Charles with specifically on particularly on China and Chinese policies. Charles, to you.
Thank you very much, Balkan. I must say I do agree with Olaf's perspectives, and Corey has some ideas on how to solve them. I do recall when I was in Beijing that when the Chinese government really put its foot down on the American air monitoring service was when someone next to the figure characterized it as going beyond all of the normal climatological categories for characterizing air quality, and simply wrote the word crazy bad with 3 exclamation marks after it, referring to the Beijing air quality that day. And at that point, Mr. Huntsman was called in to explain himself to the Chinese Foreign Ministry. I don't know if they continued with the monitoring afterwards. In terms of how China understands its role in the UN and other multilateral institutions, obviously China does not accept the notion of conceding Chinese national sovereignty by sincerely committing to comply with terms determined by transnational covenants, whose larger purpose is to serve the common goods of global peace and justice and prosperity for all. That it's always an issue, but the ideals that inform these institutions are hard to uphold. And I can give a couple of examples that build on what Olaf and Corey have already said. For example, the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, which is the legitimate agency for resolution of disputes under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, in 2016 delivered what was really a sweeping rebuke of China's argument that China enjoys historic rights over most of the South China Sea. And this Court of Arbitration ruled that China's expansive claim to sovereignty over those waters had no legal basis, and that China's construction of artificial islands to create port facilities and airstrips for military purposes was a gross violation of international law and the international waters and the sovereign rights of the surrounding nations, some of whom had legitimate claims over some of those rocky outcroppings and reefs that are in dispute. And the court ruled that Beijing was violating international law by causing what was characterized as severe harm to the coral reef environment, and by failing to prevent Chinese fishermen from harvesting endangered sea turtles and other species on a substantial scale. So, it was all a good ruling designed to make the South China Sea a safer and more environmentally sustainable place. But as we know, China disdainfully rejected this meticulously argued 479-page ruling by spuriously rejecting the jurisdiction of the Permanent Court of Arbitration and flatly declaring, and I quote, "This ruling is null and void and has no binding force." And then their foreign ministry spokesman, to make it clearer, said that China would be regarding the ruling as a piece of trash paper. Similarly, with regard to the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration on Hong Kong, which Canada endorsed when it was lodged with the United Nations, China has rejected its terms as a historical document that no longer has any practical significance, while the UK and other nations suggested it's still a legally valid treaty to which the UK is committed to upholding, and the rest of us are committed to seeing upheld. In terms of the larger factors behind China's flouting of the authority of global multilateral institutions is strangely the overall quest for legitimacy of the current Chinese regime, which insists that only the Chinese Communist Party's autocratic one-party rule can strengthen China sufficiently to achieve a foreign policy that redresses the historical humiliations of Western imperialism since the 1840 Opium War. So to us, it's a long time past, and actually in terms of historiography, not even perhaps a very valid way to understand Chinese history. But in China, the 19th century past is very much alive in the nationalistic propaganda of the Xi Jinping regime today. And it's really about getting back at the West for forcing the Qing dynasty to concede the island of Hong Kong as a British Crown colony in perpetuity, and the many other concessions made by weak Chinese imperial government to Japan and to the West in the 100 years following the Opium War, prior to the establishment of the People's Republic of China under the leadership of the Communist Party in 1949. So Xi Jinping states that the realization of the Chinese dream of the great revitalization of the nation is their overall foreign policy framework, and that this will be achieved, the planning anyway, is by the 100th anniversary of the revolution in 2050. And so the mythology, and it is a mythology, not really based on what's really going on in the world, but a mythology that appeals to the deep structure of China's national psychology, is the restoration of China to what they regard as its traditional position as the leading global civilization to which all other nations are subordinate. So it's a kind of a call for a return to a modern form of the tributary state system. And so Xi postulates this alternative global order in terms of the community of the common destiny of mankind. This was quite a dominant theme of his 2017 Party Congress report. And the idea is that the post-war institutions of the international rules-based order, being based on liberal democratic values, are at odds with China and China's ideology of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And so the expectation is that multilateral institutions like the UN and the WTO will gradually fade into irrelevance as the US continues its decline as a global power, which is what China predicts. And then China rises to the fore, leading the community of the common destiny of mankind. And so then you have the ambitious Belt and Road infrastructure program designed to commensurately restructure the global economy to China at the center. In other words, all of those belts and roads, the land infrastructure and the sea infrastructure, ultimately lead to Beijing. So, as Olaf pointed out early in his presentation, it's pretty apparent the People's Republic of China is not fully committed to the purposes of the UN as we understand them. And China has been very active in lobbying member nations to support its positions. For example, China recently became a member of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations with strong support from its UN allies. But taking into account China's activities against the Uyghurs and other gross violations of human rights, it's unlikely that China would further the purposes of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in terms of any reasonable interpretation of the entitlement to civil rights, of democratic participation, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly that all of us, whether we're Chinese or of other nations, should universally possess simply by virtue of being human. And we do see, as I think Corey and Olaf both alluded to, that many officials from China, members of the Chinese Communist Party, have assumed positions of responsibility in the United Nations, but they appear to be subject to direction from the Chinese Communist Party. And if I could just pick up on Corey's brief allusion to Meng Wanzhou, the chief of Interpol, who in 2018 abruptly and mysteriously disappeared from his post in Lyon without explanation. Under Mr. Meng, China had been using Interpol red notices in an irregular manner, at least I would call it irregular, to attempt to achieve the repatriation of people back to China, mostly people associated with the senior levels of the regime who'd fallen afoul of Xi Jinping's governance and had fled abroad to countries, including here to Canada. But with regard to Mr. Meng, it was only after days of silence and an unusual news conference by Mr. Meng's wife did China acknowledge that it had in fact transported Mr. Meng, the head of Interpol, to China, where he was being held in an undisclosed location. And then and only then did they submit Mr. Meng's resignation to Interpol, Interpol itself having no means to verify that it was in fact Mr. Meng. And exactly what Mr. Meng had done to justify his sudden withdrawal from his Interpol duties remains unclear. But this incident has left a cloud of uncertainty hanging over Chinese officials and the international bodies that are increasingly giving Chinese officials leadership roles. As my colleague Michael Castor has observed, imagine if China were somehow, someday, to get a UN Secretary General, and then he too one day simply disappeared. That is not the way it's supposed to go. Insofar as the matter at hand, the WHO, goes, it appears the PRC may have used influence to ensure its capability to shape the narrative on the pandemic in ways suited to China's domestic political demands in the early days of the spread of this severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, the COVID-19. And I think more disturbingly, China has recently justified some gross violations of its WTO commitments to trade with Australia by canceling import of a large amount of Australian commodities into China with no pretense. When our canola seeds, a $3 billion a year business was canceled, it was on spurious grounds that there was contamination in the seed shipments and the dockage. But in this case, China has quite explicitly and directly given 17 reasons why it seeks to punish Australia with $20 billion worth of trade sanctions. And among those was Australia's calling for an international investigation of the sources of the coronavirus and to understand China's communications to the WHO with regard to person-to-person transmission when the world first became aware of the spread of this disease in Wuhan. So, clearly there's something very wrong here. It's quite outrageous, but so far China has not suffered any consequences for doing what they're doing to Australia, because countries like Canada are evidently cowed into silence and tacit consent for China's pervasive gross violations of the international rules-based order in international trade and diplomacy. So I think this does lead us to further explore what Olaf and Corey have been suggesting, is that we really have to start doing something about this, or I think we can expect the Chinese regime to successively further its overall global geostrategic ambitions by engaging in greater and greater outrages against global norms. So let me leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Charles, for this very sort of extensive take on what China is doing and why they're doing that and why should we be pushing back. And let me take it from there to pose a question to the panel, and perhaps starting with Olaf, on a subject that all three panelists touched upon, that the multilateralism has a particular set of values associated for us in the West, and then it is not, engagement for engagement's sake or cooperation for cooperation's sake, and that we have to band together if we want to deal with both the subversion of these authoritarian regimes in the existing international institutions, but also to reform and perhaps build new ones. So my question is, and we can start with Olaf, and the rest of the panelists can jump in if they feel like it, is that what would an institutional structure of this sort of community of democracies that sort of goes back to the original ideas of the UN as not only a forum for just getting together, but pursuing a certain set of values. What would an institutional structure like that of a community of democracies would or should look like? Olaf?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm not sure we need a. I'm not sure we need another institutional structure. I mean, I'm a bit cautious to create another circle, another organizations. We do not have, in principle, a lack of global formats, and over-institutionalization is might be a bit ambitious. I mean, I already see how tiresome the coordination within the EU can sometimes be in Geneva. I mean, for good reasons. You have 27 member states with different interests, and so sometimes they're so tired, then it's difficult for them then to let's say to look for consensus with the likes of Canada, Switzerland, Norway, Korea, Australia, and so on. So I don't know whether another structure would be the silver bullet here. Also because it is difficult actually to differentiate what country is a democracy, I mean, and what not. I mean, I have very clear ideas on that, but some democracies are not always voting with the global West. Look, sometimes, I mean, India on many aspects, I mean, it's certainly a democracy. On many aspects, let's say, it aligns. But for example, on trade issues, it's often, let's say, in another camp. And then you have countries such as Singapore, where you can rather say, well, according to Freedom House, it's, I think, a mixed regime, or it's partly free, but it's a country which certainly supports multilateralism, and at least on some issues, again, I'm thinking of trade, it is certainly one of the biggest friends of multilateralism. So sometimes the distinction can be a bit muddy. Nonetheless, I believe coordination of the like-minded is absolutely crucial. I mean, you have, of course, this Alliance for Multilateralism. It's a Franco-German initiative, but which was also strongly supported by Canada. I think Canada was one of the co-founding members, if you want, but which is so far a fairly non-committal alliance. For me, it was really difficult to figure out in the beginning, well, what are the real criteria to take part in this? But I think that this is something which is not strongly institutionalized, but there is already a name for it. So you could turn it, or it would be good to turn it in actually what you suggest, something like a like-minded liberal democratic more or less alliance, and it not make it in a kind of feel-good initiative where everyone can join who wants, but give also some more teeth to the initiatives. I mean, they have launched in this Alliance 6 initiatives, which sound, I think, some of them very interesting, but it would be good maybe if from this kind of circle an initiative would come out for the reform of international organization, or from, I don't know, for the WTO or for the WHO, I don't know, but something with teeth and which is not kind of, and which actually can hurt, let's say, the autocratic international in some way. And I think what has to be strengthened is kind of informal coordination in Geneva, in New York, in other, let's say, multilateral cities. I mean, to kind of have much quicker to plan in advance. Or, for example, if you see that you have in 2022, I think the ITU will have a change of Director General, so the International Telecommunication Union I was ranting on about earlier. So if you see that, you say, well, actually we need to start now, or at least beginning of next year, to figure out who might be a candidate which gets a majority and which is still kind of like-minded in one way. So rather than over-institutionalizing, I think you can do a lot in an informal way or in kind of existing structures? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Corey?
I agree with Olaf that it's probably, excuse me, it's probably unhelpful to build new institutional structures. And my preferred way of orchestrating cooperation among a core of, say, 10 democratic countries, or maybe more, would be to have the Sherpas who navigate us all towards the G7 summits to 4 months earlier work that process among the democratic core countries, so that those of us who are in the G7 have pre-coordinated among other democratic countries and can represent their interests as well as our interests. And I can think of 4 areas where this would be especially helpful. The first is a white CFIUS process. You know, the United States has a Committee on Foreign Investments that judges which investments cannot be made, and flipping that around for reliably democratic countries so that we assert that our firms can have the ability to invest in all aspects of each other's economies would deepen the investment pool and be really advantageous for us all. It would help spur cooperation. The second area is secure supply chain initiatives. Japan, Australia, and India are already partnering on a secure supply chain initiative so that we, for example, break China's monopoly on rare earths processing. Doing that among democratic countries to give us all strategic depth in areas like pharmaceutical development, I think would be hugely confidence building. Third area I would suggest is cooperating on nominating heads of agencies like the International Telecommunications Agency, so that we don't put forward competing candidates, but we can all have confidence in a common agenda. And the fourth area is standard setting. You know, that we are way behind where the Chinese are on driving standard setting. And one area where I think that would be helpful as Britain bounces out of the European Union would be to encourage Britain to join trade pacts like the new NAFTA and like the Trans-Pacific Trade Initiatives, so that we help friendly countries opt in to good practices.
Thank you very much, Corey. Charles, would you like to comment on this?
Well, I think that, you know, I do think that we need to be doing more to recognize what's going on with China. And there have been some suggestions, for example, with regard to Australia, which is that in retaliation, Australia should cease to ship iron ore to China, which is, you know, China is highly dependent on enormous amounts of Australian iron ore. But this is not something Australia could do unilaterally. It would require a coordinated international effort to try and deal with this iron ore and make it clear to China that if they're going to engage in these kinds of arbitrary measures, you know, to use economic coercion to further their own political purposes in countries, that this is just not going to stand. In the case of Australia, this really goes with the Chinese expression, I think, 杀鸡给猴子看, which means kill the chicken to scare the monkeys. And this very hard line in Australia is something that China will watch and see if any other countries are prepared to stand up and say, you know, you just can't do this. I think the other problem with this institutionalization is that every country wants to have some kind of out. You know, they'll say things like, well, it's complicated dealing with China, and, you know, you can't make it too black and white. So we'll keep doing what we're doing with China and also join the US-led, you know, Alliance of Democracies or whatever it might be called. I don't, I think that this is a kind of dynamic that the Chinese regime can take full advantage of, and would, in fact, encourage them to continue to further their program of trying to remake things to serve their own interests. So I'd really like to see very strong U.S. leadership on this, really insisting that nations come into compliance with U.S. set norms for how to address China, with strong incentives for the other nations to do so. And I think if we can't achieve that, then it's time for me to retire to farming or something and just pack it in.
Thank you very much, Charles. We will come back to the issue of China and how we can push back for Chinese attempts to sort of rewire the institutional structure in a minute. But I want to sort of pivot away towards the transatlantic relations a bit. And it's probably the polite way to put it is that the transatlantic relations has been neglected under the Trump administration. But that would change, and it remains NATO and more broadly the transatlantic community remains one of the core Western institutions that protect our safety and security, but also defend our values and interests. So I want to turn this question, start with Corey perhaps. What should we do, starting perhaps with the United States and a new Biden administration, but more broadly, Germany and Canada and other allies should do to revitalize and strengthen the transatlantic community to withstand the authoritarian challenge, not only with China, which seems to be, particularly the European allies are now waking up in the past year and a half or so, but also with regards to Russia. Correct?
Yes. So the great historian of NATO, Stanley Sloan, is fond of saying that the three oldest refrains in the free world are NATO's in crisis, deterrence is breaking down, and we need new thinking. And it's a really good joke because it's both actually true, but it's also the reason that NATO is so adaptable, right? Apathy is the one thing that democratic institutions can't abide. Crisis, we're actually pretty good at dealing with, right? The Harmel report, the dual track decision. NATO has an absolute genius for combining two antithetical ideas into a common policy. And that's how we navigate new problems. So I'm actually quite blasé about the strength and durability of the transatlantic alliance because the fundamental bargain is so sound.
Live streaming is on.
So I hope that wasn't an example of Russian or Chinese technological proficiency to stop me in the middle of a love letter to the way that the transatlantic bargain is enduring, right? Because when none of us have a better option than each other, the United States can be an incredibly tiresome ally, but our North American and European friends would still rather face frightening challenges together. And the absolute same is true of the United States. We feel safer when surrounded by our friends when we have to manage big challenges. And as you point out, we are managing big challenges, right? That we are so good at defending our territory and our values that the Russians and Chinese have had to move to an asymmetric strategy of trying to use the openness of our free societies as a vulnerability. But we're already figuring out how to handle that. We're learning from the Swedes and the Finns about how to build societal resilience. We're learning from the Baltic states about how to protect our cyber networks. We're cooperating with each other, learning how the French defended their election systems. And that's what the NATO alliance is genuinely brilliant at, stealing good ideas from each other and working them to scale. So I don't think we need particularly new thinking. We just need to continue doing what we've always done pretty well.
Excellent. Olaf, do you want to pitch in particularly maybe how it is looks like within Europe and going forward with the new administration in the United States?
Well, I think most countries or most governments are very eager or are very let's say not completely dissatisfied with the outcome. I would, however, argue, and now a bit oriented towards Europe, regarding too much complacency. I think Europe has also to be very patient, because until you actually, I mean, the Biden campaign, Biden will have to probably, and Corey, please correct me if I'm wrong, but he'll have to deal with so many issues at once that it may take time. Also, I mean, we'll see how the Senate will look like, of course, and which has then again consequence for appointments. And this in turn has consequences for the reform agenda also in the multilateral organizations. And I think the EU or EU member states should be cautious not to become too complacent and not to become, now we can go in the old free rider mode. No, this would be extremely dangerous, and I think this would really hurt the transatlantic relationship for good. So actually, to try to also be more decisive in choosing the right camp. You have sometimes this, for me, highly irritating discourse about equidistance between the US and Russia, or the US and China. This is incredibly, this is completely the wrong mode, in my opinion. And even if we talk about strategic autonomy of the EU, which I think is an important discussion, it should never be strategic autarcy. And this is something which should be kept in mind, which also leads me to the fact we should, as Europeans, not just gloss over difficulties in certain multilateral organizations just to have kind of multilateral harmony. This is very important. I mean, certain criticism of the US of the functioning of the WTO, of certain issues in the WTO, will not go away, I assume. The tone will change, but certain issues will not go away. I think the EU needs to be more understanding and more proactive regarding the US point of view of a more moderate administration.
Thank you. Charles, would you like to comment on the transatlantic component?
Well, I think that, I do think that personality does have some relations. The very non-productive G20 that just happened last weekend, I think a lot of the reason that it was non-productive is that those people were not meeting face to face and interacting with each other as people that they can sympathize and trust and build up some rapport with. And clearly the Trump factor, while probably historically Mr. Trump may not come out looking that bad in terms of the actual impact of his foreign policy. The thing is that people really don't like dealing with someone who is such a blowhard, doesn't speak the truth, and keeps arbitrarily changing his mind and violating international commitments. The business of barring Canadian metals import into the United States on national security grounds. I mean, it's a relatively unimportant thing, but the impact in terms of our desire to get together with Donald over a beer and work things out was, fairly severe. So I am optimistic about Mr. Biden's ability to engage with Canada and Europe and other like-minded allies. He's got a reputation going back a long time of being a person that is trustworthy and is amenable to argument. And I think the people that so far he's choosing for for key positions, particularly Mr. Blinken, bodes well for future stronger collaboration. And, as I keep talking about in terms of the China situation, it's high time that we got someone that we can work with to actually start to respond in a way that will stave off further deterioration of the values that inform how nations can engage with each other in justice, peace, and prosperity.
Excellent. Let me get to the question of, we have been talking about what we should do and what the United States should do and how we can engage in other democracies should do. But one important aspect in foreign policy is also knowing what not to do. And the sort of increasing calls, particularly with the United States in the incoming administration, but not only in the US, in Canada, in Europe, there are calls for engagement with China and engagement with Russia. And generally, this is portrayed as just innocent attempts to open up dialogue. But it is important to keep in mind that one needs to be aware of things not to do. What the limitations of those engagements should be. What should be our red lines when we engage with China and engage with Russia on the fundamental rules of international order, on the structure of international institutions, etc. So, what should we not do when we are engaging with Russia and China? Corey, let me start with you on that.
I love that question. Well, let's see. I would start by saying what we should not do with China or Russia is take reciprocity to a ridiculous extreme, as I believe the Trump administration has by only allowing Chinese journalists to be on temporary visas in the United States. Reciprocity, that is, you will have access to our market as we have access to your market, is a sensible enough principle. But they've taken it to the ridiculous extreme where it makes us no different and no better than China, right? Like, we believe in a free press holding governments accountable, including our own government, including foreign press. And so by saying that since China is bouncing American journalists out of China, that we will do the same, again, I think that's really bad policy because it says we're no different and better. Another thing I think we should avoid doing is allowing the governments of Russia and China to tell our stories for us. Even in their own space, that the refugees that Germany, for example, took in during the 2015 crisis, Russia tried to tell a story about violence and terrorism and the undercutting of Germanness. And in fact, the story of Germany's refugee admission of over 1 million refugees is a great story about modern Germany. And that it has worked so well is something that all of us should be celebrating. And media will cover it if our governments pay attention to it, right? I mean, having a meeting of NATO foreign ministers issue a statement about it would be a beautiful thing to do. So we're missing the ability to tell our own stories and letting authoritarian governments prey upon the openness of our free societies. We need to use the tools of free societies to defend free societies. The last thing I will say we should not allow Russia and China to do is over-militarize the nature of the conflict we have with them. Our conflicts with them are ideological, right? They are about the nature of free societies or repressive societies. And allowing China to narrowly channel this into the military control of the South China Sea plays to their advantages of trying to create a sphere of influence on their borders. When what we are trying to create is a zone of peace in which governments are representative of their people and have the ability to choose whatever foreign relations they believe protect and advance their interests. And if we allow Russia and China to turn it into a military confrontation, we not only accept their framing, but we play to their advantages.
Excellent. I just want to pick on that last point, and before turning to Charles on this point, that it is very important, I think, to highlight the fact that by purely making this about just two great powers fighting it out like they always do, creating this moral equivalency in these two systems, I think, is a path we don't want to go, and that's a path that works to the advantage of these authoritarian regimes through whataboutism and whatnot. We should highlight the nature that this is about fundamental values. This is an ideological competition, and trying to turn this into just off-the-shelf great power competition and grants a moral equivalency to these authoritarian regimes that I don't think they do deserve. Charles, to you, what should we not do? What should be our lines of engagement? Where should we stop? What should be our red lines?
Well, I do think that the points you raise are important. The saying that, there are no moral equivalents with the Chinese and Russian regime. Therefore, should we be engaging in, say, parliamentary exchanges where we suggest that, oh, yes, the Democratic U.S. Congress is the U.S. valued parliament, but, the Chinese National People's Congress, a rubber stamp where the members have no constituencies and meet 10 days a year to vote 90% in favor of Communist Party revolutions, is simply the same because, China is different. I mean, this is nonsense. And I do think that we should challenge, as Corey suggests, disinformation much more aggressively. And I'm inclined to oppose the idea of internet sovereignty and think that we should be actively breaking down the firewalls that these nations put up to prevent the free flow of information to their citizens. The other thing is, in general, accepting the discourse that China and Russia put out with regard to irredentist regimes or sovereignty. And most significantly would be the status of Taiwan. The Chinese government suggests that Taiwan is an illegitimate regime that should be shunned internationally. And we know that this leads to quite a lot of objective issues with regard to, the WHA or ICAO. Taiwan exists and diseases pass through it and airplanes fly over and around it. Clearly it makes sense that Taiwan should not be excluded simply because of the political imperative of the People's Republic of China with regard to the status of Taiwan as a renegade province of China, and a position that at least the Canadian government doesn't accept. We simply acknowledge the Chinese government's claim. And the bottom line here is that the current Taiwan regime under Tsai Ing-wen and the Democratic People's Party has a high degree of legitimacy because it was affirmed by a free and fair democratic election in which all perspectives were allowed to contend. And so there's no question that the government of Taiwan is a legitimate government representing the people living on that island. And therefore, the idea that they should not be represented in the UN and should be excluded from international discourse simply because the Chinese government tells us that we have to abide by that or else, I think it's time for us to just say that we're sorry, but the Taiwan question is not really one that we're concerned about in terms of your own claims of sovereignty, but objectively speaking, that government is in effective control of that territory and therefore should be recognized by us as such. So I think there are any number of areas where we have had this sort of country agnostic approach where we're prepared to accept what other countries say because, its diversity and respect for their sovereignty, when in fact what we're really dealing with are autocratic dictators who lack political legitimacy, who should not be allowed to pretend that they have it.
Excellent. Olaf, let me turn to you. And one thing that you said in your opening statement, and I think it's an important point to re-emphasize, is that multilateralism for multilateralism's sake is not the story. This is not an in itself, but it's a means for protecting interests and values and a common understanding of how sort of the world is or should be. So, given that, what should we not do when we engage with? What are the sort of pitfalls, in other words, when we start engaging with China and Russia? What should we be aware of? What should be our red lines be?
Well, I think I can basically build on what the previous speakers have said. I think we should, for credibility's sake, and this is, I think, an important point, we should be aware that China is actually playing quite well along the rules in many organizations, which says sometimes something about the rules as well, which sees that sometimes maybe they should be reformed, and maybe the WTO's rules were not prepared for state-led capitalism, if you like. But for example, in the ITU, it's not that they are breaking rules there. I mean, they're just very, very present. They do what they can do within the rules in many cases. Sometimes they may curb them. That's absolutely true. But in many organizations, they act within the rules. So if we attack them in that sense or calling them rather out on their strategy, we have to be very careful how we do it. Just basically to very flatly imply, yeah, there is a Chinese conspiracy going in all these organizations. That's not a very strong argument. I think we have to see why sometimes certain organizations are misfunctional, and it's not the answer is not always because China is somehow infiltrating them everywhere. I mean, the answer has to be a very cautious one. So, because otherwise, let's say calling China out on certain practices or certain discourse will have less of an effect, because you will be accused of hysteria. So you have to look very carefully what strategy to take in which organization. I think it is also very important to withstand this discourse, what the previous speakers have mentioned, meaning in the Human Rights Council, for example, you know that you will not get a resolution through on Xinjiang and the situation of the Uyghurs. I mean, this is sad. Of course, this is sad. But the composition of the Human Rights Council basically reflects the average of the member states, or of the states in the world. And there, China has always kind of a majority in order to block these kind of resolutions. However, we can still call them out. We can still make, as the UK did, for example, a joint statement. And there there everyone can join. And there you see who aligns him or herself with China, who does with let's say, with the global West. It's actually to make things more transparent, which is also important. And even if you don't get a resolution through, even if you have, let's say, the close allies of China basically always defending them on everything, it is still annoying. You can still be annoying. You can still be a pain. And I think we should dare to do this more, because, and this is something which is a silver lining. If you look even in the Human Rights Council, where a lot of things are, where you have an asymmetry of dealing with certain member states, you still see, yes, China is again in the Human Rights Council, but it was voted with fewer votes than the last time. And also some of these Chinese resolutions to change the discourse with this kind of discourse on mutually beneficial cooperation, undermining let's say individualistic or the definition of individual human rights, actually, the first time this resolution was passed, I think 2 years ago, I think the US was, or 3 years ago, the US was the only country who voted against, and many were not sure how to respond. Now the resistance was bigger, so I have the impression that some of the countries are actually waking up to that. So to kind of push back and not let them go through with this. And on some issues, what should we do? We should engage more in some of the organizations we might have underestimated in the past. I've mentioned the ITU. It's not only government representatives which sit there and decide about standards. It's the industries. But for example, the European industry has been quite absent in many of these fora, which is a huge mistake. Maybe they were not aware of that, but this goes also not only mobilizing our government, but also other actors which do play a role in the UN system in order to withstand this kind of discourse, but also the, let's say, the very strong engagement from the other side. So to create a better balance, I think we can do a lot on this.
Excellent, Olaf, and I'm glad you brought that up to this particular point, because it really ties nicely for the following question. This time I want to direct to both Corey and Charles. What you have started, what are the sort of the concrete policy suggestions and ways in which we can push back to the authoritarian regimes in the existing institutions when they try to co-opt them or reshape them to their liking and to their interest. And Olaf got us started into very, very actionable and concrete suggestions over there, how we can push back and what should we do. But I'd love to hear both from Corey and Charles on what we should do to counter these attempts in more concrete sense. Corey, maybe we can start with you and then Charles.
Sure. Well, I'll pick the one that I think most urgent and that we are failing worst on, which is all of us in the global West ought to be standing shoulder to shoulder with Canada and demanding the release of Canadian hostages taken by the Chinese government. It's outrageous that the Chinese government has done this, and we should be together using every opportunity to hold them accountable for it and to argue that this is behavior that China itself will suffer from if it becomes the international norm, as countries begin taking Chinese hostages when Belt and Road Initiative programs go belly up. China's the world's largest creditor, and it's going to have really important choices to make about whether it forgives debt or behaves egregiously awfully as it is currently behaving towards the government of Zambia, demanding preferential treatment as a creditor. There are so many ways in issues of the day where we can drive the price up for law-breaking behavior, for norm-breaking behavior, and all of us are better protected when we band together. And Canada, the hostage taking of Canadian citizens is one where we are disgracefully silent, or when we raise our voices, we don't do it in unison, and we should be.
Excellent. Charles? You're muted, Charles.
My space bar stopped working. Anyway, I think that this is an issue, and as Olaf correctly points out, it's unlikely that the United Nations will condemn genocide in Xinjiang. Well, the Genocide Convention was the first UN convention, and so it's more than regrettable that nothing is going to be done about it unless there's some action outside of the United Nations. And I think it's similar to, the international response to Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Svaver, which has been, something like 16 countries that have made statements of concern, some of which were more strongly worded than the others, but none of which I think made a whit of difference for Kovrig and Spaver, who actually after these statements were made, had their consular access withdrawn for something in the order of, I think, 8 months. So, obviously we should be putting Magnitsky sanctions onto Chinese officials who are complicit with the crime of genocide. And, there are a lot of Chinese officials who have significant wealth in foreign countries, particularly in Canada, engaging in real estate and money laundering. I mean, Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei herself, when she was arrested, had in her possession 7 passports and owned 2 large mansions in Vancouver. And I presume if she had 2 mansions in Vancouver, only being able to live in one at a time, she must have others elsewhere. But anyway, if we had a unified approach where the Magnitsky sanctions were simultaneously enacted by many countries, then things might start to disincentive the Chinese regime from continuing with these sorts of outrages. If there was a consensus that we will not go to the 2022 Winter Olympics so long as China is holding Kovrikin's favor and so long as China continues to have these concentration camps for the Turkic Muslims in the Northwest, then, that might have an effect. But one always hoped that institutions like the UN were supposed to be able to address this kind of issue. The UN not being able to do so, then I think we have to start to look to alternative institutions that China cannot subvert by co-opting the elites of UN member states to ensure that nothing is done in the UN that China sees as hostile to its overall global interests.
Excellent. And I want to sort of switch to some of the audience questions. I think we actually, addressed several of them that came before the session. But I want to sort of highlight 2 here. The audience, combining several questions here. The audience seem to be interested in how to reform the existing institutions. Hugh, for example, asked, "Is the UN beyond reform? And if not, how can we reform it?" Raul asked, G20, how can we reform G20 if it is floundering, and what can Canada do about it? So let's sort of combine these questions. How can we reform the existing institutions and work through them to achieve what we want to achieve, or are they, at least in some cases, beyond hope? Olaf, let me start with you. Maybe if we can keep the comments to a couple minutes so that we can get to 1 or 2 questions more before we end this up.
Yeah, sure. I think there is no silver bullet for a quick reform of UN organizations. I mean, one or the other is certainly not in a very good state. And we should never forget that, of course, it is difficult to reform certain UN organizations against China's will, of course, or other authoritarian countries for that matter. Let's not pretend that China is alone here. I mean, on many issues, there is a broader consensus. I mean, just a brief comment. Charles, you mentioned Taiwan and their absence from the World Health Assembly. I mean, everybody's always concentrating on the Director General of the WHO. Oh, how can you not invite them? I mean, he basically refers to, look at what my member states want to do. And you can be sure if you would make a vote on this, the large majority, I think probably 3/4 or something, or 2/3 at least, would side with China on that. So this should make our expectations regarding UN reform, of course, realistic. Nonetheless, I do believe if we pool our initiatives, several initiatives which we have in the West, for example, on WHO reform, I think something can be done. Now, how can this look like? And I'm just outlining 2 points. I think one is making financings more solid. I mean, if an organization has to basically grovel every year before the member states, especially in front of big member states, to get the necessary funding, and if assessed contributions are just 20% of the overall financing, of course they will not criticize member states, any for that matter, neither China nor the US nor anyone, because of course they know that they may be cut off funding. So this, and also it affects their work. It reduces the quality of their work. So I think you cannot address reform without addressing the finance issue. And the second one would be that exactly you try to pool initiatives, and also, even if it might hurt, insist on stronger mandates for these organizations. Give them, I mean, I'm not even dreaming about sanction mechanism, because this is completely unrealistic, but at least try to increase at least a bit their monitoring role. Because then again, they will have maybe less to grovel before member states before they let them in. If you want to look, for example, on the origins of a virus. But again, even these reforms would be a tough cookie. But if you try to pool the reform resources or the reform strength of the global West, then at least you might have a stronger chance or a bigger chance to achieve at least something in that direction.
Naming and shaming, perhaps, using the monitoring mechanisms could work in that sense. Corey, let me turn to you.
So I agree with what Olaf just said, but I don't think you need to make institutional reforms in order to make the institutions effective. All you need is to put a whole lot of effort to getting the majority of countries in the General Assembly to backing up good initiatives when countries that are outside the Security Council have good ideas. So structural fixes would be preferable. But, you know, the genius of the American government is that it's so porous to good ideas and initiatives from outside it. And the same is true for the NATO alliance. So we can do this. It's harder at the scale of the UN, but it's not impossible. And if we really want to save the institutions and make multilateral institutions effective, we need to put our shoulder to the wheel and commit the political effort that will help countries find it effective as it is.
Charles, let me turn to you, and maybe if you can bring in the Canadian component as well. Given what you heard and what you think, what Canada can do to make these institutions more effective and perhaps push for reform?
Well, I think that I agree with Corey and Olaf that the problem lies with us. It's not just the bad guys, Russia and China and Iran and so on, who are subverting these global institutions. It's because we haven't been proactive enough in preventing that from happening. And certainly within the UN system, we need stronger special rapporteurs. We need more of these optional protocols allowing civil society reporting into UN covenant reporting mechanisms and so on. And if we were a bit more proactive and put a bit more vigor into it and allocated stronger Canadians to these roles, then I think we'd see a difference. Right now, most recently, Canada has sent a very strong UN ambassador in Bob Rae, and he is making a difference. He is speaking out. He is mobilizing the international community, and I think just the force of Mr. Rae's integrity and character, and strong abilities as a diplomat, does actually make Canada a bigger player in the institution. So I think that, of course, reform is a good idea, but I think it's also a question of political will and the allocation of resources to make our participation in the UN more effective again. And certainly Canada has a tradition of this. I think a lot of Canadians still think that we're an important player in multilateral institutions, but the bottom line is that our commitment has weakened since the Pearson era of the mid-'60s, and I think it's time for us to turn that around.
Excellent. We are slowly coming towards the end of the session. I want to ask one last question and perhaps very brief answers before moving into the sort of your final closing statements. This is a question that audience submitted before the webinar, and Paul asks, what are the prospects for global coordination to prevent the next local viral outbreak from turning into a pandemic. Naturally, everybody's mind is occupied with COVID. Anybody would like to take a shot at this, but quite briefly, and then we will switch to the last comments.
I think you go ahead, because you speak more optimistically, Corey, and I'm just a downer.
let's go with Corey and then Charles.
I am more optimistic because I think, but my optimism is based on the self-interest of countries. Not managing this pandemic well has been exorbitantly expensive in human lives, in economic devastation, in all sorts of ways. And that gives us an enormous incentive to cooperate going forward. And I'm actually pretty confident that all of us will struggle through and find a way to provide better information early, to rush resources from all of us to wherever outbreaks occur, and to find a way to cooperate to prevent a recurrence of the terrible damage that we're experiencing.
Charles, go ahead.
I would say, we certainly forgot about what happened in the aftermath of SARS, and as we know, in the Canadian government's own behavior, started to dismantle institutions that were designed to coordinate effectively with the international community on pandemic control. I don't think we'll make that mistake again, but certainly it's the same as the overall theme of this, is we really need to have governments who believe that international collaboration is important, and to allocate the resources and effort into making them effective. And I mean, but the bottom line is, with pandemics, I know that there's going to be a lot of attempt to, after the fact, to try and figure out what went wrong. A lot went wrong, and I'm not sure that we can stop things from going wrong the next time in different aspects.
Olaf?
After a very, let's say, encouraging and somewhat less encouraging outlook, maybe I try to go a middle way. I would say you do have now a window of opportunity to do the necessary reforms. I mean, there are various reform processes, or at least working groups dealing with that in the WHO context. But we know from past experiences that windows of opportunity for reform close very quickly. So I think now, until basically mid next year, is a very crucial time to increase the pressure on this, because what we already see, I mean, there are, at the last World Health Assembly now in November, you had a couple of voices arguing we basically, from the US, from the EU, from Canada, from other countries, we need to increase, let's say, the monitoring by the WHO, and let's say more transparency in how dealing with a pandemic and so on. And then let's say also reform the international health regulations in that way. And then immediately you had, I think, China, Russia, and Pakistan saying, well, let's not open up this Pandora's box. So already in this kind of, I would say, on these steps, you have resistance. And this resistance will grow with time, of course, once you get out of the worst. I think still that the pandemic was big enough to represent a strong shock, that this cannot happen again in that way, and I think one should use this kind of energy. But let's also be clear on one thing. The pandemic went as it went, not because of the WHO, but because member states were not ready, because national health systems and national pandemic preparedness has not been ready. So the bulk of the work has actually been must be done on the member state level, on the nation state level, and I think this is something which also let's say an evaluation of the world response on the pandemic should bear in mind. Don't look only at the WHO, but also look at how member states have reacted. The very last piece here. Let's say the WHO has proclaimed the kind of emergency state in the end of January, but many member states did not really react. So I think this should be borne in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just very quickly take your last sort of commentary, wrapping up statements here, starting with Corey and then Charles and then Olaf. 60 seconds each. What would you like to end up with in terms of for our audience leaving this webinar? What's the one thing they should remember from this particular webinar? Corey.
I think the one thing they should remember is that multilateral institutions are hard to make work well, and there is no better alternative to making them work well.
Charles?
I think that, I quite agree. I think we have to cease to be bogged down in the process of meetings and structures and look at the purposes of these institutions and come up with means for them to fulfill their purposes. With regard to the pandemic, I think Olaf makes a very important point, which is that the window of opportunity is narrow. The Chinese government will do everything they can, and I dare say the Russians and other nations as well, to prevent the UN from having access to critical information about their national response, because the regime operates in an autocratic and secretive way. But I think, like a lot of things, such as Corey's reflection on Kovriken's favor or the Xinjiang genocide, it's time for us to say to the Chinese regime that we just will not tolerate you not behaving in the way that you're supposed to in accordance with your international commitments. And we have to define some red lines and pay the cost of a regime like China that's refusing to stay within those red lines.
Olaf, what's one key takeaway?
Well, the situation is not hopeless yet, and we need tough love towards the multilateral organizations. Engaging but insisting on reform and not gloss over deficits just in order to have a harmonious picture and a harmonious consensus in the end.
Thank you very much. We are just 2 minutes over our allotted time. I would like to thank all the panelists for this fantastic panel, and for the audience for the questions and staying with us for this MLI and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung webinar on international institutions. We hope to see you in the upcoming webinars as well. Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.